Memoir opens the door to a private world. My guest tonight is going to explore that private world and its universal application. The subject tonight is caregiving, and this is part one of a three-part series. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Page One, the award-winning show for writers with the reader in mind.
That draws the reader along, just like fiction.
Here's your host and producer, Zita Christian.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. Usually when I open this show, I tell you that I'm welcoming my guest. Well, I am tonight welcoming back my guest. She was the very first guest on Page One when we started the show in March of 2004. It's been a long time, so now I have the delightful pleasure of welcoming back Elizabeth Thomas. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks for inviting me back.
And this is actually your third time on the show.
Yep.
And as I mentioned in the beginning, this is going to be the first of a three-part series all about writing a memoir. So I'm guessing, I don't see how it could be otherwise. You're going to be the person who's been on here the most times before the show actually sunsets, whenever that day comes.
Nice. Thank you.
You're very welcome. So when I first met you, which was even before 2004, back when I was with the Bushnell, I knew you as a poet, obviously, and as a teacher, teaching students and coaching them in slam poetry, putting together teams, national competition. What I'm learning now is all about this wonderful blog that you have and this new adventure about memoir. So tell us first the title of the blog, because I know how this leads into everything. So tell us the title of the blog and then the title of the memoir.
The blog is Here is a Kiss, and the book is titled Here is a Kiss.
And what does that mean?
It's a tribute, I guess, to my dad.
Yeah.
When I was a little girl, as a lot of us, of this generation, my dad would come home from work about 5:30, Monday through Friday, and he would come in the front door, and we would all be lined up to give him a hug and a kiss to welcome him back home. And I am one of 5 children, the other 4 are boys. So I was his only daughter, and he would say to me, give me a kiss. And he would say it in Italian. And I believe, and I don't know if I say this right, I'm probably not even saying it right, it's just in my memory as demobage. And I would say, here is a kiss. And I would give him a kiss, hello. But, as a way to show him my love and my respect. And
I think that's a beautiful title, because I love the story behind it. And it also is the perfect title for your blog. So the blog, I'm assuming, is because of the titles, is feeding into this memoir. So I guess probably one of the biggest things I want to be sure to tell you, it might be obvious based on how I said this is going to be a 3-part show, but this memoir is not yet published. And I'm taking advantage of that fact by, you're my willing guinea pig. So today what I want to do is talk about, where you're getting the material and what some of this experience has been like. And then maybe on the second show, X number of months from now, no pressure, but we'll talk about where are you in the publishing process, because I know when we talked, we met at the restaurant the other day, and you're exploring, maybe seeking traditional publishing or looking at indie publishing, which is so much more common today than it was years ago. And then on show number 3, we'll have you back, and we'll talk about the book and the marketing and the reception and all that sort of thing. So for today, the whole idea about the book, I think one of the basic questions is, What, in your opinion, makes a memoir worth reading? Because on one hand, somebody might say, well, I have my own life. I don't want to read about somebody else's life. But there are reasons why people do, because it's such a popular genre. So what are your thoughts on that?
I love memoir. I'm a very nosy kind of person that way. I think that's a big part of it. I like I'm the person that drives down the road at night and and I'm looking into all of the windows
With the lights on and the curtains open. I do too.
Do you? Yeah. I just I what's going on in there?
Yeah.
And so for me, memoir is very interesting. Almost no matter what they're talking about, right? But I think it needs to connect. Your story needs to connect, and it's just a part of your story. That's what makes it memoir. It's just a part of your story. It's not the whole story from the day you were born to the day you die or whatever.
Not an autobiography.
Exactly. It's a part of it, and for myself, this book, this story, is about my mother and my father and taking care of them for 10 plus years after they both went through some very significant medical issues. My mother in 1996 had a brain aneurysm, and 3 days later my father had a massive stroke.
Oh, Elizabeth.
And so, and they were very independent before that. They had just come back from a road trip visiting my youngest brother in Texas and his family. They weren't back a couple of weeks when my mother was having difficulty seeing, and the aneurysm was actually pushing on her left optic nerve. And so she, went to see the eye doctor, who said, you need to get to the hospital now. And then 3 days later, she still hadn't come out of the anesthesia. She was still, unconscious, basically. And my dad had a massive stroke.
Oh my gosh. She did go to the hospital right away, though. Then,
She did, and they operated, the very next day.
All right. So the memoir all about caregiving, and as I mentioned, in the opening, this is Elizabeth's personal view, her memoir, her recollections, and about what happened. But certainly, this is a universal topic. Caregiving is, I think, one of the biggest, most important issues facing more people than I think we realize in the world today.
Absolutely.
If you would, this is page 1, and usually I like to have the guest read, from page 1 of the book. Well, I realize the book isn't ready yet, but I did look, I read the blog, so I know what you've got on there, and I'm hoping that you would read the introduction to the book, because I think that gives us a lot of good information, good access point.
Sure.
Okay.
I'd love to.
Take it away.
I'd love to. Those of us who assume the role of caregiver are seldom ready. We may grow into it over time, but more often than not, we go to sleep one night only to wake up the next morning to a completely altered life. It doesn't come with instructions. Support is scattered and random, as dependent on the state in which we live or to whom we talk as it is to the individual situation. Though male caregivers are on the rise, the typical elder caregiver is a woman in her mid-40s with some college education. She spends more than 20 hours per week caring for a nearby parent or family member while holding down a full-time job. She has children who need rides to soccer games and school dances, who are coping with their own changes and fears. She has a spouse who sometimes feels neglected. She is pulled in many different directions, yet feels guilty she is not doing enough. Like that to me is like huge. In 1996, the lives of everyone in my family changed with the sudden and simultaneous decline in the health of both our parents. What happened over the next 15 years affected me, my brothers, and our families in various resounding ways. While our children grew, went to school, got their periods and driver's permits, we wiped our parents' chins and bottoms. We said things to our mom and dad that we never could have imagined, and as often, we bit our tongues bloody. Through trial and error and the compassion of others, we learned what it means to be caregivers.
And boy, is that a loaded introduction, because there's so many issues that you raise in here that, a lot of people I know are going through or have gone through. And I think that does make it that far more universal than we realize. One of the things that I want to touch on, you had mentioned just a minute ago about how this is a memoir, not like the whole story of your life. This is not autobiography. So you are looking at a finite period from when everything changed for your parents, when their health changed, to when? Obviously you're going until after they passed, but does the memoir stop then? Is that the plan, or is there beyond?
The memoir actually does end when my mom dies, which was in 2012. What winds up happening at that point is even the blog tends to sort of stop, because for quite a period of time it was hard for me to write.
It's called grief. Yeah.
And it took me a while to go back into it. At that point, it was the first draft was sort of finished, but it needed a lot of revision. And each time I tried to go back into it, it was very hard. So it kind of ends around 2012, but continues over the next several years in terms of revision and in terms of where I needed to get to.
Well, I wanted to mention a friend of mine, Maureen Murdoch, multi-published writer and a lot of memoir, and she has a blog called Unreliable Truth. And one of the things that she says in there is that memoir, she said, you can't remain unaffected by reliving the events that happened, even if they were decades ago. So I think about that and I think, because you're going in, when you're writing, you're going in so deep, because it's part of the catharsis for you as the writer, but you're also creating something that you hope will sell and will appeal to a reading public. And that gets back to that whole thing you said at the beginning about when you're looking for a public that is nosy, inquisitive, you need to give them something to keep their attention, but that means that you're going deeper and deeper into the pain.
It is, and it's ongoing.
Yeah.
It's ongoing. So, one of the things that has come about because of what we went through and because of writing the blog particularly, people call me, they email me. I get a lot of questions from people who are just now maybe going through it. Questions about things that it is not easy to find the answers to online or with a phone call. A lot of times it's you have to experience it. Like one of the big things is, geez, my mom isn't doing so good anymore, but she still wants to drive, How did you manage to convince my mother? My dad was unable to drive after the stroke. He was paralyzed on the right side. But even though my mother had the worst double vision of anybody and, was not ever quite the same again, she still thought that she could drive. And did behind our backs for a while. Once they were both out of the hospital and out of rehab and living somewhat independently again, she wanted to continue driving.
Now you bring up an interesting point, the fact that people are contacting you. So these are people who are going through something similar, or they're looking for information to help somebody else. So tell me about some of the things. In fact, maybe the better way to do this is I'm going to suggest that you go to Elizabeth's blog. One of the posts on there is called and I forget now the title, 101,
Caregiving 101.
Caregiving 101, that's the one. That one's loaded with all kinds of things that, you need to know if you're a caregiver or you know somebody who is going to be in that situation. One of the things that you mentioned early on when we were talking the other day was that you don't know you need the information. I mean, you don't research stuff that you don't need, and then suddenly
No.
you need it, and now you're scrambling. So give me just a little rundown of some of the things you cover in that Caregiving 101.
Well, for one thing, the HIPAA laws, okay? Now, before this, neither one of my parents, they were each other's HIPAA person, their privacy person.
Yeah.
None of us kids were. So one of the first times that I had to bring my mom to a doctor appointment, and I'm the one who made the appointment, I called up to see if it was at 10 o'clock or at 10:15. And the person on the phone said, well, I can't give you that information.
Oh.
I can only give that to Maria, my mom, Maria Thomas. And I was like, well, I'm the one who's bringing her to the appointment. I made the appointment. I just don't know if I have it down correctly. Is it 10 or 10:15? You can't, she would not give me that information. And my mother wasn't really able to have that conversation yet at that point. I had to call my aunt, her sister, and say, Aunt Julie, here's my mother's social security number. Could you call up because they're going to ask for the social, they're going to ask for her birth date,
Right.
and ask what time the damn appointment is. Like that kind of, you should be that person on.
The fact that you have the Social Security number, I mean, I would think that in itself would be something. It's like, oh, how many people have their
I didn't
parents or
have
someone's?
it. It took a while to find that.
Okay. So there's a lot of things, like that. I want to backtrack just a minute because the whole idea of Memoir, this is your perspective about how, what it was like living through this as a caregiver for your parents. Right at the very beginning of the show, though, you mentioned you're one of 5 children, you have 4 brothers. So their perspective would be different.
Yes.
So talk to me a little about, let's just pretend that any one of them is writing a memoir. What's the perspective, do you think? I mean, I realize you have to use your imagination, but from the person who is not the primary caregiver. I mean, I remember when my dad was the caregiver for his mom, and there were other siblings involved, and everybody didn't participate in the caregiving, and it caused problems.
And that is obviously not uncommon.
Yeah.
In the beginning, I felt like the brunt of the decision making fell to me.
And that's pretty normal.
Yes,
Yeah,
it is.
It is.
Well, just in the introduction, that was
Yep.
that was the way it was. So all the bill paying, the doctor's visits, and, it was for both my mom and dad, for many years. And my brothers, like if I, they worked full time, and one of them was out of state, but, they worked full time as I did, but I worked for myself, and as a writer, so they would say to me, well, you don't
do
really
your job.
work.
Do your job at 2 in the morning. Yeah, no, I get it. I get it.
You don't really work, so why can't you take mom to the doctors?
Yeah.
Toward the end, it changed.
Yeah.
Toward the end, we were all pitching in.
I think that's part of the process too, because people just don't realize what all is involved. They just don't, because there's something in the brain, I think, that says, well, this will be over like a month or 2 months from now, and then you find it's not. I mean, yours went on for, what was it, 15 years?
Well, this happened in '96. By '97, because I remember my 40th birthday, they were living back together again in an in-law apartment that they had built onto my brother Bruce's house years before this. But it was out in New Hartford. And so it was far away from everybody except for my brother and his family. Right. And so over time, we were able to get them moved into senior housing in South Windsor. So they were closer to most of the rest of the family, including my dad's two sisters, my mom's sister, cousins, things like that. People who are willing to, to help out a little bit.
There's so many different considerations. And so there's another blog post that I would love you to read because I think it gives a flavor for your writing and for what we're going to find in the memoir. And that's the one about Happy Happy Land.
The Happy Happy Land?
Yeah.
Okay. It's actually, I think, my favorite.
Oh,
and
good.
Part of it being my favorite is that I felt so blessed to have been there to have the conversation with my mother.
Yeah.
Right? Because my mother was never a philosophical person. You never really got to know my mom until the last few years of her life. And then she would tell you all kinds of things. And as her only daughter, it was...
Oh, yeah. Treasures.
Yes, treasures,
Right.
little gifts. So I wrote this in 2012, not long after my mom had died. Last summer, I was sitting on her bed, rubbing Ben Gay on her back. "What do you think happens when we die?" I asked her. She turned and gave me the look. "Well, if you're lucky," she said, "you go to Happy Happy Land, I guess. At least, I hope so." We were brought up Catholic, complete with catechism and holy days of obligation. I looked at her. "You mean like heaven?" "I don't believe in heaven," she said. I was stunned. "What's Happy Happy Land then?" "It's where, if you were good, you're never sad," she said. "But if you were bad, you turn into a rock and someone kicks you down the street." "Do you believe in God?" I asked her. She paused before answering. "I believe in something bigger." "You pray, though," I said. "I've seen you." "Yeah, but really I'm just talking, like I talk to you or your brothers." "What do you talk about?" "Well, mostly I ask to keep you all safe. And sometimes we talk about recipes." My mother and I never had conversations like this, and I was loving it. Then she added, "And usually I say something about you all being happy, because it's hard being happy, you know?" "Yeah," I said, wanting to hold her and cry, knowing she'd probably sock me one if I did, yet so glad that I had not been in a rush that day or needed to be somewhere else. Happy I was there to have that conversation with her. Unlike my brothers, I don't have a clear vision of heaven. I believe in God, but heaven is a bit out of focus. So if we stick with my mother's idea of Happy Happy Land, here's what I think it looked like last Tuesday afternoon when she died. My dad would be kicked back in a cushy recliner, not because he cannot stand on his own, but because it is the most comfortable seat in the house. His amazing smile lights up his face as he turns to say to my brother Joe, "Hey, Joey, go get your mother." And this is a good thing, since for those of you who knew her well, she's probably lost, and Joey can't wait to go find her.
Oh, Elizabeth, that's beautiful.
Thanks.
That's beautiful.
Thanks.
I hear the poet. I hear the poet in there. So that leads me. In fact, even I should say this before we get too far. And I make this mistake so often. I get all caught up in the interview. But if you're just watching the show, if you just happen to tune in, this is Elizabeth Thomas. She's a good friend of mine. She's a writer, a poet, a teacher, and she's now writing a memoir. And this is the first of a 3-part series. We're going to talk about this whole creation of the memoir. What I'd like to ask you, maybe just like a little teaser as we go along, and I realize you don't know yet because you haven't stepped into this, but the actual process of the book. Well, this part you do know. Structure. You chose to begin each chapter of the memoir with a poem. So why was that, and how did you pick the poems, and are they all yours?
The poems are all mine except for one, which my dad wrote.
Oh.
My dad was a poet also. he was not published, but he loved to write poems. And I actually have one of his journals that he had kept. I never knew he kept a journal with all his scribblings and, lines of poems and his revision process. And it was pretty...
Oh, Elizabeth, what a treasure.
It is a treasure. I love just flipping through it. But I decided to do it that way because when this first happened, I had no idea that there would ever be a book out of it. But as a poet, I was writing a lot of poetry throughout. When I work with new writers, I won't just say kids, because I have a couple of programs I do with senior writers too now. I try to explain poetry as a way of unclenching the fist that squeezes your heart, right? So it could be squeezing your heart because you're sad about something, or angry, or confused, or excited, or joyful. But there's still that squeezing, and it makes it hard to breathe.
Yeah.
So when you write, I've always felt that it unclenches that. And
Yes.
you can take that deep breath. You can, your headache goes away, or you can sleep again, that kind of thing. So for me, the poetry writing was critical at the time. Going through it was critical. The journal writing I did was critical.
Yeah.
And so I include a poem at the beginning of each chapter, and the poem sort of tells you what that chapter is going to be talking about.
Okay.
Okay? And then throughout each chapter, I didn't do this originally, but somebody suggested it after I was keeping the blog for a while. They said, your blog entries, so many of them are funny. Maybe you should put some of that in the book also. And I thought, they're right.
Yes, so you've got poetry, you've got blog entries, and I'm getting the signal that we're about out of time. So the next time I have you on the show, we're going to talk about all these various sources of material, where it's all coming from, how it goes in, and exploring your thoughts on seeking traditional publishing versus indie publishing. And I think, too, to the degree that you're willing, exploring what is that reflection, what new things do you learn about yourself from going through the process, and family reflection, family reaction to a memoir. I think that's important, too. So a lot of things to talk about for the next show. So,
Great,
Elizabeth,
good.
on that, the optimistic note, thank you very much for being back here again on
Thank
Page
you
One.
for asking me to come
Sure.
back.
And I want to thank my crew as well. And
Thank
I love
you.
to, yes, I got a great crew. And thank you and the viewing audience. I love to close this show with the words of the late fantasy writer Ursula Le Guin, who said, "There have been civilizations that did not use the wheel, but there have been no civilizations that did not tell stories." So find your story, find a way to tell it, and join us again next time. Thank you.
Food for the crew and guests is provided by Manchester Grill of Manchester, Connecticut, and Angelo's Restaurant of Glastonbury, Connecticut. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email Zita at zitatv.com or write to Zita Christian, Page One TV, P.O. Box 1515, Manchester, Connecticut 06045-1515. You can watch this and other episodes of Page One on youtube.com/Zita3x3.